This week marks the arrival of a new selection of FPS Boost supported games on Xbox Series X and Series S. But this time we have a selection of Bethesda titles, including two favorites of mine, one especially, Prey and Dishonored Definitive Edition. But there's a lot more to this enhancement than just the FPS Boost feature. The leap here is so significant that these games go from almost unplayable on Xbox One in certain ways to extremely polished and smooth on Xbox Series X and S. And to discuss this, I wanted to bring in someone who has also played these games, Alex Battaglia.
Hey there, John. Yeah, I've played these games in the past, not necessarily on console, on PC, but that's actually a nice comparative point, I think, to what we're seeing here through this FPS Boost on Xbox Series consoles. But yeah, thanks for having me.
And yeah, I also played through these games myself on the PC, and that's for a good reason. But okay, let's kick this off by looking at Prey first. So, Prey was one of my favorite games back in 2017 when it was released. It's basically an immersive sim, a 0451 style game, very much in the mold of something like the System Shock titles. It was developed by Arkane Studios in Austin, and it's powered weirdly enough by the CryEngine, which is one of the reasons why Alex is here today, of course. But yeah, kind of as I indicated before, this really is kind of a System Shock style game, and it's much more true to those originals than something like BioShock. It's a more complex game that asks more of the player. There's more inventory management and things to figure out.
Yeah, for certain. It takes advantage of its hub style gameplay much more than a BioShock game did in the past. And it has kind of, I don't know, you're very right about the item management aspect and also the persistence of the world that you're in with like going around and finding the various scientists that are there and the kind of roaming enemies of a variety of types that you don't necessarily always want to get into combat with. Which is another great thing. There's a lot of avoidance of combat in this game, which I really liked at the time. But console versions back then, I remember this at launch, they were definitely not too great, right?
So yeah, that's the main problem, and this is why I chose to play the game on PC. It was really never very good, but it has three main issues. Firstly, there's the frame rate, which I think is probably the least impactful here, where it's capped at 30 frames per second, and it's reasonably stable, but it wasn't perfect. And in fact, when it was patched with PS4 Pro support at a later date, that version also had some new issues in regards to performance.
Brutal, yeah.
But the real issues, I think, tie into input latency and loading times. So at launch especially, the game had a lot of input lag issues. It was extremely unresponsive and difficult to play. It just didn't feel good to aim the camera or shoot at enemies. They did patch this, and it did improve noticeably, but it was never quite as responsive as I would have liked. But the loading is really the big problem here, is that it took a very long time to move between areas, and that's a real problem for this game because it's designed to be sort of a seamless space station that you're exploring, and you'll go back and forth between these areas, and each area is somewhat persistent. So when you're moving between the different zones and it can take over a minute to do so, it sort of discourages you from wanting to actually explore the space station. This would become a real problem in the late game too, where you would actually need to go back and forth between the different sections of the space station in rapid succession, so you might have to deal with 4 or 5 different loading screens on the way to the next objective. Now, it did actually receive an Xbox One X patch, which boosted it up to 1440p, but it was still capped at 30, and the other problems were still an issue. So we're kind of looking at a multi-pronged upgrade here. Obviously, FPS Boost is the reason why we're discussing the game right now, but the other areas have also received significant improvements on the new machines. But what do you say we start with the FPS Boost stuff, since that's kind of the big feature here?
So basically, in your playthrough here that we've been talking about, and it's more or less a flat 60 FPS here on both the Xbox Series X and Xbox Series S consoles. On Xbox Series X, along with the FPS Boost here, it's playing out the game using the Xbox One X kind of resolution profile at 1440p there. So you're looking at a CryEngine game at 1440p at 60 FPS, and with that kind of like frame coherence of 60 FPS and the AA solution that was used, this was using, I think, what was like SMA T2X at the time. It actually looks rather great from an anti-aliasing perspective on Series X, from what you were just showing me. It's a rather modern looking game now at this kind of performance and visual profile coming together, frame rate and everything.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the main takeaway here. Most of the FPS Boost titles we've looked at thus far, aside from, I guess, new Super Lucky's Tale, they've only supported the original Xbox One, so you didn't get that boost. Whereas with Prey, this is actually a 1X enhanced game, so you get a higher resolution in addition to the boost in performance. Also, the 1X patch added things like screen space reflections and pushed out the draw distance of lights and stuff like that. So it looks noticeably better when running on Series X. But of course, as you would expect then, the Series S is just running the original Xbox One code path, which means those features are absent. But thankfully, it does still deliver a very stable 60 frames per second experience, only with those occasional tiny blips that we noticed on both of them. But really, it's pretty good. So that's problem one out of the way then. So the other two things, and honestly, together, I kind of feel like these things make the biggest difference here. The next one, I guess, is input latency. Now, I mentioned that this was patched, but the game was never that responsive, I guess, on consoles. And yeah, the launch version was really bad. But when you combined the most recent version of the game with the FPS Boost updates, the game finally feels genuinely responsive on consoles, I think. The aiming and general movement is much, much smoother overall, and it now feels on par with how you might play on the PC with a gamepad, I suppose. So if you hadn't previously wanted to play the game because you thought it felt bad to play, that was your reason. It was an input lag problem, and that is gone on the new consoles. So that's problem two. The next thing, though, and this is the biggest one, I think, more so than the other two combined, and that's the improvements to loading. So this was the major problem with the game back in the day, and this is why I never found it enjoyable to play on consoles. Is because, as I said, you move between these areas often, and the loading times are unbelievably long on last-gen consoles, even over a minute on the Xbox One S. But when you play it on both of the different series consoles now, the loading times are so much faster that it's a true game changer. It's now comparable to how it was on the PC. It's just a little over 10 seconds. So you can kind of move back and forth between all these areas with minimal pauses. So yeah, this is an absolute game changer for it, and really makes this a really nice version of the game to play now.
Yeah, just the way you put it, you mentioned that you played it originally on PC, and just thinking about how you played it back then, running it on an SSD on PC. And this experience now, through the FPS Boost, and also through the other aspects of backwards compatibility that are being applied here, 16 times AF, the improved loading, and all these other things, it's more or less like a upper mid-range PC experience now on Xbox Series X, especially where it's 1440p 60. That's not exactly something every PC GPU can do out there. Just to kind of put that out there. This game, I think, on the original Xbox One X, especially, was one that if it had a different kind of CPU, it could have been 60 based upon the GPU they have in there. It may be at a different resolution, but here, now coming over to Series X, there's just enough power there in the GPU and CPU side to put this version into the realm, I would say, almost like a PC kind of style game now, which is great because I always thought this was a very much so PC designed game, and that's the way to play it. So this is kind of really excellent news for people who like this game that probably didn't get enough praise at the time when it came out, maybe due to some of these console version problems.
Exactly. Which is to say that you too can experience one of our favorite games of 2017 now on a console in a really nice condition. And I think that's really the key here. In fact, looking at all the FPS Boost titles we've checked out thus far, I kind of feel like this one has received the biggest boost overall, to the point where it almost feels like a pseudo remaster re-release of the original game, enhanced for the new machines. Beyond this then, moving on to the next game, this one also comes to us from Arkane. So I downloaded and started the game up on my Series X, mais j'ai trouvé un problème avec le jeu. Il était en français et je n'arrive pas à trouver comment le changer. Mais comme le jeu a été créé en France, c'est normal. I'm sorry. So yeah, the game is stuck in French on my Series X, and no adjustment of the settings anywhere seems to change this, and I'm not really sure what's going on there, because it's actually not that way on Series S or 1S or anything like that. So very weird way to kick things off. But like I say, it is a French developed game, unlike Prey, which was developed in Austin, so it kind of works. Okay, so this game is interesting then, because it actually dates back to the PS3 and 360 era, where it initially launched, and it didn't run especially well on there, so I also played this one on the PC. So Dishonored is based on Unreal Engine 3, and this ran extremely well on PCs of the era. In fact, even a 750 Ti will give you a nice stable 60 frames per second experience.
Yeah, 750 Ti in terms of like its actual graphical compute power is like not even that much better than most, I don't know, like an 580 or a 480 Fermi card. It's like really low end, and it pushed this out at 60. So when this game launched after its PS3, Xbox 360, PC debut, ported later, earlier in the gen, onto the Xbox One and PS4, it was limited to 1080p 30, which at the time, after having played it on PC really easily at 60 FPS, it was kind of a, I don't know, that was kind of a big, that was the early in the generation. It was a big downer to play such an older generation game still at 30 FPS at the time.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and this is kind of par for the course for some of those earlier Xbox One and PS4 conversions. But of course, being that it was so early, it also never received any sort of patch for PS4 Pro or Xbox One X, which means that it is limited to 1080p on all platforms in this case. But anyway, so this one actually has two main improvements, loading times and frame rate. And since the main focus of this video is of course the FPS Boost improvements, we should probably start there. And I guess this one's interesting because out of all the titles we've tested thus far that use FPS Boost, this is the first one that actually exhibits some minor issues. And these issues were also present on the original base console. You can see what I mean if you just look over at the frame time graph there. There's just some slight inconsistencies that pop up.
I wonder what exactly is causing this, because basically I've had this happen before in a PC game recently, Horizon Zero Dawn, but John was just showing me kind of through it all that you could notice minor dips and hitches occasionally associated with UI elements popping up on the screen. This is something that didn't happen in the PC version to my recollection at all, and I do wonder if this is kind of a legacy issue with the engine itself, from the time for whatever they did on this original Xbox One version, or if it's something else, because this is so early in the Xbox One's lifetime that this is probably using the DX11 version of whatever kind of porting tools they had at the time. So I wonder what exactly the issue is here.
Yeah, it's really weird. And yeah, you're right, it does happen a lot with the UI pops, but playing more, it does seem to just kind of happen when sort of moving between certain areas, so maybe it's an IO stutter or something like that. It's not really a big deal per se, but it's definitely something that I noticed just while playing, because you kind of get these little hitches as you make your way through the levels. And yeah, it's equally the case on Xbox Series S, which has, of course, the same exact issue as does, like I said, the original Xbox One S. So it does seem to be something that's endemic to this game specifically.
Yeah.
And it's something that the FPS Boost technique can't actually fix.
It could not possibly be a real CPU or GPU limitation given the massive amounts of quantity of processing power that Series X has above the original Xbox One,
Precisely. I mean, that really shouldn't be an issue here. There's clearly something going on internally with the game that's a problem, but at least, it's good enough, I'd say. The main thing, though, is actually the loading. And so I mentioned loading for Prey, but I think in Dishonored, it actually makes an even bigger difference, because the nature of this game is that it's very sort of experimental. It encourages you to play around with the AI and sort of explore the levels, which means you can fail and die at certain points. The problem is both entering the level and restarting upon death, it's very, very slow on the base Xbox One. I mean, it is horrendously bad. The fact that when you die, you have to wait so long to try again absolutely destroys the urge to sort of mess with the game and mess with the AI because you don't want to deal with these constant loading screens. And even then, the environments themselves are broken up into multiple chunks, so you also have to encounter loading screens there. So when looking over at the backwards compatible version on Series X and Series S, then the difference here is perhaps even larger because it's almost instant. You just see the loading pop up for just a second, then you get the A prompt and you're in the game. The game loads 23 to 38 times faster on the new Series consoles versus the Xbox One.
Yeah,
it certainly makes a big deal when exploring the world, but it's especially important for the moments when you actually get killed and have to retry. So, I mean, to me, this is really a case of the game going from what I would consider basically unplayable, as in a version I would not ever want to play personally, to a version of the game that feels excellent to play. It's just fast and responsive and it loads super quickly.
I do really wonder what exactly, if it's like the worst case scenario on the original Xbox One where it's like a bunch of tiny files separated or something like that need to be being spun on the HDD, because I have no idea why it takes so long to load on the original Xbox One. Yeah, those numbers don't line up necessarily completely with what we see on Xbox Series X and S being so much faster. But that's such a great thing, because like you're saying, in this game, when I played it, I would spend a lot of time, like I do in games like this, Thief-style games, learning the levels. And in this one, you could be a little bit more fancy, I would say, with how you play than like in a Thief game. So like, you know, getting the kill off in a really cool way. That was something that you could do, but that would require experimentation and dying and needing to reload. And that was not something that would be at all fun at such long load times like you would find on the original Xbox One. So this is an amazing update. I like it a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of where we're at with both of these games. It's really transformative for the gameplay. It's probably the best example we've seen yet of backwards compatibility enhancing a previously released title. I mean, I really would not want to play these games on the original consoles, due primarily to the horrible loading problems. So fixing that, bumping the frame rate up to 60 FPS, and generally just polishing the whole thing up with the extra horsepower, it really is transformative. It's so much better to play these games now.
Yeah.
And the thing is I feel like these problems, especially with Prey, may have led people to miss out on them in the first place, and really, if you enjoyed something like BioShock at all, for instance, which I guess is the closest analog of a game that was popular and sold really well, play it. You've got to try it. It's so much better now, and it really is just an amazing take on the genre. Very much worth experiencing. And honestly, the same goes for Dishonored as well. I mean, I kind of prefer the second one overall, but the original is still a brilliant game, and that also kind of follows off of I guess the Thief games in some ways.
Another thing that I want to mention about both these titles is we're looking at a CryEngine based game, and as well as a late PS3 360 era UE3 Unreal Engine 3 game. And the fact that it works very well, this FPS Boost works very well in two very different engines from two very different time periods of release, I think it bodes well for other FPS Boost titles that we might see in the future that are based on these engines. You know, like with CryEngine, there wasn't a lot of CryEngine titles actually out last gen, but I think a game like Rise would be a really perfect title for an FPS Boost, considering it has a PC version that runs rather perfectly at 60 FPS if you have the right hardware. And then, you know, in terms of Unreal Engine 3s, there's so many Unreal Engine 3s games that started off either on PS3, 360, or on Xbox One. You have things like Arkham Knight, right? You know, imagine that at 60 FPS. I'm not sure if it could be done because, you know, looking at its PC version, but imagine if that was smoother than the PC. I would laugh so hard.
It's not impossible. Yeah. I mean, the console version didn't exhibit those I/O-related issues that we saw on PC.
Yeah, it did.
I mean, you move that over to the SSD anyway, and yeah, I mean, I feel like there's real potential there, and that's definitely one I'd love to see.
It'd be so cool.
But yeah, I mean, in the here and now, you know, it feels like this FPS Boost program is off to a pretty good start. I mean,
love it.
That we already have more titles after that initial selection. It really bodes well for the future of this kind of stuff. So that's really great to see. And yeah, these games, absolutely amazing. Definitely worth playing. Of the new Bethesda games that were just added to this, personally, I think these are much more interesting than Fallout or Elder Scrolls, but I know those games have huge fan bases, and yes, we will be taking a look at those soon. But I think that's going to do it for this video, so thanks for joining me, Alex.
Of course, Dejan.
And if you guys enjoyed it, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, all that good stuff. Check out our Patreon, follow us on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Alex signing off and saying...
Auf Wiedersehen.